Today, we're sitting down with recently separated Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Scheller. Scheller served 17 years as a Marine Corps infantry officer and completed multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. In August of 2020, following an attack on Hamid Karzai International Airport, which took the lives of 13 American service members, Scheller took to social media to demand accountability from senior military and government leaders.
Potentially all those people did die in vain if we don't have senior leaders that own up and raise their hand and say, we did not do this well in the end. Without that, we just keep repeating the same mistakes. This amalgamation of the economic / corporate / political / higher military ranks are not holding up their end of the bargain.
These public calls immediately went viral, leading to Scheller being relieved of command, imprisoned, court-martialed, and eventually separated from the Marine Corps. Scheller joins us today to talk about what motivated him to speak out, his philosophy on leadership, the fallout which surrounded such a decision, and what's next. Stu, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. Not a problem at all. Thanks for joining us. So, right out of the gate, what joined you, or why did you join the Marine Corps?
Yeah, good question. So I always played sports. I was always on a team. When I was younger, I thought I had to go to college. So I actually majored in accounting at the University of Cincinnati. I thought back then that an accounting degree would transition to the FBI. I always knew I wanted to be part of a team, serve America. But going through college, I thought it was going to be the FBI route. And then when I graduated college, I was actually working as an accountant. And that was right when the war was starting to pick up in 2004. I saw some video clips of the Marines moving through Fallujah, and it spoke to me. And I thought I'd like to go over there, test my skills as a leader, and be able to serve my country, because I believed in a lot of the freedoms and the opportunities in America. And so I called the Marine OSO recruiter and started the process.
Awesome. And what was the draw of the Marine Corps? Was it the challenge that presented? Was it the type of people that historically have been written about with the Marine Corps? Was it, part of your peer group that was going that direction?
I'm not really sure. I've gone back and reflected why the Marine Corps, why an officer. I really just didn't know a lot about the military. The closest I had, my grandfather was in the Army, and he landed at Normandy in World War II. He did his 4 years and then got out after World War II. And so that was the only person in my immediate family that I could talk to about the military. I had a soccer coach that was a Marine officer, and he said a couple times that I'd have made a good Marine officer. And I guess just somewhere in my head, I thought the Marines were the best. And when I was watching the news, it was the Marines that were moving through Fallujah. And so for all those reasons, I think it just enough seeds were planted that I decided to go that route.
That's a heck of a motivator. That was a pretty intense fight.
It was.
Absolutely. And as a side note, and they'll probably cut this, but that was one of the motivating factors that drove me to the Marine Corps. I was in college at the time and dropped out. But in terms of your philosophy on leadership, what is that based in? How did you formulate it? And what does leadership mean to you?
Leadership to me is developing a shared understanding, being able to influence your people and move them towards a common goal. It starts with holding yourself to a standard that you're never going to ask your men or women to do something that you wouldn't do yourself. It starts with being approachable and being a human. I feel like a lot of times you can be a leader but be less effective. So it's not you're a leader or you're not a leader. It's a matter of effectiveness. And ultimately, leadership is about dealing with people. And so how you can talk, engage, work with people is critical. And so that requires a high emotional intelligence, not necessarily an academic intelligence. And in the military, I've worked at all the schoolhouses. We say leaders aren't born, they can be developed. And I've engaged in this conversation many times. But the truth is, there are inherent characteristics that allow some people to be more successful at leadership. Now, can you develop all of these? Absolutely. But in terms of charisma, in terms of relationships and talking to people, being humble, all of these things sometimes are greatly influenced by your upbringing. And so when you get to the military, some people have characteristics that can be, I think, developed a little bit further. And so that debate will rage on, but ultimately being a leader is about engaging people and getting them to move towards a common goal, whatever that might be.
You mentioned background, upbringing in terms of developing, a particular leadership style or an approach. How did your background and your upbringing influence the type of leader that you turned into in the Marine Corps?
My parents were in a stable marriage. I had brothers and sisters. I had a lot of opportunities as a kid. I played on select soccer teams, and my parents had the resources to allow me to travel and experience things. I went to Europe when I was 18 and played on a traveling soccer team. So, there was the competitive aspect of it. Then just looking at what my father did, he essentially at 23 was selling all these racquetball memberships as a salesman, a very successful salesman. And then the racquetball membership company went out of business. And then he had sold all these memberships to his friends and family and was ultimately like driven out of the town. And so at 24, this guy had really nothing. And he married my mom, and then they had me, and he started working his way up the healthcare industry. And he did it very successfully just through hard work. And then he ended up going off and being an entrepreneur at about my age, at about 40. He started his own brokerage firm, and he just became very successful. So to me, it was literally the story of an American that's willing to put in the work. That you can really do a lot of things. Now, are some people in life given bigger hurdles that they have to overcome? Absolutely. But does everyone have opportunities? I really believe that they do. And so, being on a team, watching my parents, different teachers and coaches, they all just filled me with probably characteristics that transitioned well to the Marine Corps.
Understandable. In terms of, you've spoken a lot about accountability, accountability up the chain, accountability down the chain. Where does that fit into your personal leadership philosophy? And do you have a particular perspective on how up the chain, down the chain accountability meshes together with the entire picture of leading people or leading a unit?
Yeah. So, I started with, I don't think you should ever ask somebody to do something you're not willing to do yourself. And they just kind of expound upon that. Accountability is not the answer. The bigger problem that I've been talking about with the general officers is that their sole purpose should be winning wars and advising the National Security Council correctly. And they are not doing that. They have figured out how to navigate their career and emulate the characteristics of their bosses, which is not necessarily synonymous with winning wars. And quite often, the people that are just extremely focused on war fighting, but not necessarily these other things that their bosses are saying are important, end up washing out. And so what I think accountability will do is address, if you have a senior officer that's figured out how to navigate his career all the way up to 4-star, but isn't focused on winning wars, at a minimum, holding him accountable will force other people to take notice that, hey, maybe we should also be focused on winning wars. The bigger problem is how you home grow a military officer up to the senior ranks that has the insight and ability to push back when things don't make sense, because right now we just don't have that.
Where do you think the military departed from that particular, that onus or that push on what you're talking about? Because I've been reading a lot about, say, the Chosin and the Korean War recently, and there was a constant flow of accountability upwards and downwards. You had battalion commanders, regimental commanders, division commanders going down and getting in the snow, the muck, and the blood throughout the entire early stretch of Korea. Do you think that there's a particular point where the military has departed from that kind of perspective and that kind of emphasis on what a leader has, or do you think it's gradually eroded over time? And what do you think the way to get back there would be?
I think the departure was really after World War II. Korea is an interesting case study because Korea still had a lot of the World War II veterans. And so you look at Korea, you had a guy like MacArthur that was able to evaluate the Pusan perimeter and say, we're going to land at Incheon. And everyone was like, no, it's not tenable. We can't land here. We got to land further south. And that general was able to convince everyone
to include like the National Security Council equivalent back then, the Navy, and say, no, we're going to land at Incheon. And he achieved, whether you want to call it tactical or operational success, I would argue that that was operational success. Mm-hmm. But then MacArthur continued to push north under the assumption that he was going to be able to use tactical or nuclear weapons against the Chinese. And we had a president who also was a war veteran from World War I, Truman, who told the general no. And so, like, there is an example of the system working probably exactly as it should. You had a general that was able to have really good insight and influence the situation, but you also had a president that was willing to jump into the tactical play of the problem and say, no, that doesn't make sense, because bigger picture, if you start using tactical or nuclear weapons against the Chinese, it opens the floodgate for nuclear war that I'm not prepared to do right now. And so Korea is an interesting one. But then, you know, once you move on from Korea and a lot of those veterans kind of wash away and you get into Vietnam, Vietnam's really where it went off the tracks. We weren't firing any generals. Most of the failures in Vietnam are, in my opinion, at the operational and strategic level. You can always go back and look at a bunch of tactical failures. I mean, they're there. But ultimately, I believe the major failures occurred at the upper levels in the same manner that they have in the GWOT wars. So you move on from Vietnam, and then you have Desert Shield and Desert Storm, which kind of throws us for a mix, just because we had success. But still, even then, my opinion is, had we clearly signaled that Saddam Hussein, had he invaded Kuwait, we would have responded with military force, we quite honestly probably could have avoided that whole engagement. So in my opinion, there was still some strategic failure there. But George Bush Sr., having been a war veteran, was also able to stand up to people that said, you need to go for the kill and finish it and build a democracy. And he was able to tell them no, right? So, and then, you know, you move into our GWOT generation. I'm skipping over a lot. Like, there's a ton of other failures in there. You look at Somalia. Man, I grew up watching Black Hawk Down, where they just glorify this fight. And that was like one of the reasons I was like, man, this is awesome. I want to do that. But like, as you get older and study the operational failures of that thing, you're just like, how did those guys ever get put in that situation? Like, what general was fired over that? There wasn't. And so, yeah, I mean, your question was, when did it start? Somewhere after World War II, we lost our way, and we've confused ourselves because there's been blips of success. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the consistent problem of senior leaders not being held accountable for winning wars has not been prevalent enough, and we need to go back and address that.
I'd like to pivot to August of 2021 real quick, and try to tie this in. So, in August 2021, you made your first video, which started the rest of this, well documented. Was there a spark that led to you making that first video?
No, I went into that day not expecting to make a video. Like, that wasn't pre-planned. But the events leading up to it, it's just my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. Everything I'm talking about were ideas that I had been developing through reading and writing. I studied in command of staff, foreign diplomacy, and how I thought we could make it more effective. And then when Afghanistan started happening, I couldn't wrap my brain around it. I mean, we decided to do a withdrawal from April to September, which is literally the peak fighting season, right? I mean, just that alone, like the start of the strategy, it was like, why are we not doing it from September to March? Like, that would make more sense. So then I was bothered, and then I was watching when we abandoned Bagram Air Base. Like, I've spent time on Bagram Air Base. It's hard for people to fathom how critical that piece of key terrain was. Even when Trump made the conditional, hey, we'll withdraw if you do this, to the Taliban, which they didn't uphold. So in my opinion, that wasn't even relevant anymore. In that plan, if you look at it, the last thing that we left was Bagram Air Base for all the right reasons, because of how critical that piece of terrain was. And then we just evacuated Bagram. We just let the Taliban walk in unopposed. We left like prisoners in the jail, weapons. Like, we didn't tell our Afghan partners. I mean, it just blew my mind. So I'm getting angrier by the day. And then the commandant, in response to that, released a message saying, you know, if your sacrifices were worth it, yes, they were. But if you're struggling, go seek counseling. And that really bothered me, because I felt, victimizing the service member. We have a real suicide problem, and they don't need to be just told, like, hey, if they're struggling, they have problems and they need to go seek a therapist. He needed to address the root cause of why they were upset, which is senior leaders failing to win wars because of poor strategy and poor operational design. So I was mad about that. You know, another week goes by,
and then when the attacks happened, I started getting texts on my phone, pictures of some of the casualties, and this was maybe at 11 or noon. And I just started writing. I was sitting in my office at Advanced Infantry Training Battalion, School of Infantry East. I just started writing a message that started with, I have a growing discontent and contempt for my senior military and political leaders. And I went from there. And then by the time I wrote it it was done at like 6 o'clock, I thought, you know, I feel strongly enough I'm going to make a video. And then even if I make the video, doesn't mean I'm going to post it. I made the video. And then even then, I understood the ramifications of posting it, so I didn't post it right away. I drove home and tried to think about it, and I was like, maybe I should sleep on it. But I thought, man, if I sleep on this, it's going to be one of those things where if you wait too long, you're just not going to do it. And I really feel strongly about this. And I knew then that no senior leaders were going to be held accountable. The Marine Corps had already pivoted to talking about China and about how to fix the force at the tactical level. And I acknowledge there might have been some professional articles that came out over the next 6, 12, 18 months about our failures, but the failures were clear to me in that moment, and I didn't want to wait. And so I decided to post that first video.
Did you expect to be received the way it was? And can you talk about how your chain of command, I guess, counseled you and dealt with you?
So if you go back, you can see that I articulated in that first video that I knew I was risking my job, my retirement, and my family's stability. So I had obviously thought through that. When I made that first video, I assumed that there would be an investigation, and then following the investigation, I may or may not lose my job, but that would probably be the end of it, and that people would start talking about my message and address the content of my statements. What happened was they just relieved me immediately, told me I was going to go up to Quantico and potentially, you know, best case scenario, sit in a cubicle for 3 years. But I may still face legal action. And even after that, I mean, I was surprised that they relieved me within 12 hours without any type of investigation. But if you go back and look, I posted like my command's doing exactly what I thought they would do, and I just appreciate the opportunity. So I still, at that time, didn't plan on resigning, didn't plan on making any other videos. But then that was a Thursday. I'm sorry, that was a Friday. So I posted the video on Thursday, so I got relieved on a Friday. As I went through the weekend, I had previous bosses and people just getting on my social media publicly shaming me, telling me I should resign, that I lacked honor. And I just came to the conclusion that based on all these events, the Marine Corps probably didn't care about me as much as I cared about it. And I could just remain quiet and allow them to bully me. But, you know, I'm a warrior. I believed fully in what I was saying. And so I decided, hey, I'm already exposed here. The only way out is all the way through. And so I thought, I'm not going to allow them to bully me if what I'm saying is true. So I'm going to go aggressive and resign and tell them that I expected them to address my statements of accountability. Now, in that second video that I made, I probably was too emotional. You got to understand the full context of that situation. Like I knew I was giving up everything, and I didn't make multiple videos. I made one cut and then posted it. And so that's like the one where it was just so emotional. It made everyone kind of take a step back and go, what's going on here? And so I allowed people to get distracted from my message somewhat with that video. But at the same time, I mean, it's hard to appreciate somebody giving up everything they've done in their life because they believe in something so fully. And it was like, no one wanted to acknowledge that I might just be principled. So immediately it was like a million narratives were run about me, everything except maybe he just really believes in what he's saying. Like nobody said that. And so then as the Marine Corps started attacking my mental health, calling me an extremist, the divide at that point was irreconcilable. And so I continued to go forward with the resignation. They continued to go forward with legal action. And it basically just continued to escalate because they never addressed the content of my statements. No one ever put their arm around me and said, hey, we understand what you're going through. And it resulted with me in the brig and then my court-martial and separation.
What was the basis for the Marine Corps sending you to the brig?
They said that, well, the order that I violated was a gag order that said I couldn't post anymore.
And I posted and actually quoted the gag order saying I couldn't post anymore. But in order to do that, according to the manual for court martials in the UCMJ, lesser forms of restraint had to be applied and I had to be a flight risk. You could probably legally argue lesser forms of restraint because they gave me a couple counselings and then ended up giving me a gag order, but they didn't like take my phone or computer. They didn't restrict me to base. Maybe they didn't feel like that was necessary for a lieutenant colonel, and I kind of see that logic. But to say that I was a flight risk, I mean, they just lied. You can go back and look at the record. Like that's on the paperwork they submitted and even reaffirmed, because once you're 48 hours in, the commanding officer has to like reaffirm his position. And he did. He reaffirmed, yeah, Lieutenant Colonel Schiller's a flight risk. And I had been coming into work every day. And so that was a little disappointing.
In terms of your chain of command, did anyone at any point in time reach out to you and try to counsel you offline, kind of see what's going on? Having spent time in the Marine Corps any number of times, my NCOs or officers, if there was a problem inside the platoon or the company, they make it a point to pull people aside and try and talk to them offline. Did you have anything like that occur?
I did have one friend that did that, and then he shared the text to the investigating officer to show that he was trying to figure out my motive. So, it just felt like everyone that was trying to reach out to me was trying to hurt me. And so it was a very challenging situation.
How do you feel about the Marine Corps after having separated? You proud of your service still? I'd imagine so.
Yeah, everything I've done is from a love of the Marine Corps. Marine Corps made me the man that I am. I would never take back all my experiences, even through the pain that I went through those last 6 months. A lot of it was self-inflicted, and I did it because I love the Marine Corps, and I probably wouldn't change any of that either. Even the things that I wish I maybe had done differently, if you go back and pull the thread on those, like I still may not be ending up in the position that I am now, which I feel like I'm in a strong position. I did what I believed in, and we'll let the chips fall, but I'm trying to move forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that the American military is still one of the strongest militaries in the world. There just are some fundamental issues that are not being addressed. I mean, our current Secretary of Defense is saying that the number one problem is COVID. He's also talked a lot about extremism, but he's not talking about procurement. He's not talking about education. He's not talking about winning wars, holding generals accountable, the things that a Secretary of Defense should be discussing. And so, everyone has pointed out that it's not my place to say all these things, but my counter question would be, well, who else is saying it?
Understood. So what's next? What's the ultimate objective for you, and how do you see yourself bringing accountability to the process?
Step one was having a public conversation. I honestly hoped I would influence more change while within the system. I did everything that I could by myself and limited effects. But I think that there's enough people and things around me, resources, that I have built something where I think I can influence change. And so now that I'm out, I don't know. Like I said, I'm trying to look forward. I'm trying to develop resources that will help me put people in places that do have the courage to make the changes that we need. Because, I as a lieutenant colonel only have so much influence in middle management, but on the outside with the places that I want to go and the people that are supporting me and people that I'm supporting, I think we can make changes. We just got to get the right people in the right places.
You mentioned before while we were talking that you have formed a political action committee, and it was fairly conservative leaning, but the door is open to anybody who wants to join. How's that going? And do you guys have any traction in terms of bringing people in from the Democrat side, or anybody popped up and talked to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't create the political action committee. I partnered with it. So it's called the Disabled Veterans PAC. You can find it on my website at AuthenticAmericans.com. There's ways to donate there. It's been around for a while now, but its influence is growing by the day. And I believe in their cause. The guy that founded it was a previous tank officer and went on into the business world and made a lot of money. And then, once you get later in life, you look for a higher purpose and not necessarily just monetary gains. And so he pivoted to try and bring some conservative values back to the American government. And I just aligned with him ideologically a lot. So I do have a coalition of candidates that I'm supporting. I think that Congress needs leaders and not politicians. I understand that the people up in DC are our representatives and not necessarily our leaders. That being said, I think that they do need to possess leadership qualities and to be able to do some of the tough things that we need them to do and not just look out for self-preservation. So you can go to votesforvets.org and see a list of the candidates that we are supporting, and then I'll probably go on the campaign trail with through the 22 to try to get some of these guys and gals in places that they need to be. Most of them are conservative. We do have engagement with some people on the left. Like the PAC is not partisan. If you look at my website, AuthenticAmericans.com, you can see clearly on the homepage where I talk about, I think that the extreme right and the extreme left are doing more damage to this country, and that the central right and central left actually probably have more in common with each other than the extremes of each side of the party. And so I think we're never going to all agree on everything, but there are things that we need to take a look at, and just the old model of just right or left, I think, is misleading and probably requires a little bit more critical thought. And I'll just give an example of a Democrat. Like Tulsi Gabbard is a previous Democrat congressional woman, and every time she speaks, I'm like, yeah, everything she just said, right? So there's an example of like someone I feel like I'm completely in line with, even though if I were to analyze all her views, I'm sure I don't agree with her on everything, but there's a lot of key messages that she's making that I do subscribe to. And so, yeah, we try and keep an open mind, and we just look at each person individually and see where they fall.
To circle back to the issue of accountability and the way that you exited the Marine Corps, it's kind of a two-part question here. Did you see any avenue inside the Marine Corps that would have allowed you to bring up these issues without getting in, without stirring the pot the way you did? And do you have any kind of message to people inside the Marine Corps today or the military today writ large who might be sharing the same kind of thoughts and looking for a way to push their concerns up the chain of command? Do you think there's a way inside to do that, or does it have to be on the outside?
I would never recommend somebody do what I did, but I will say that you need to identify your values prior to conflict. And when there's something that you truly believe in that's part of your values, you need to really analyze your situation and figure out if it's worth fighting for. And that's what I feel like I did. I don't think that had I worked within the system, I mean, this isn't something that I thought about this beforehand. Mm-hmm. Does going through the system via IG complaint, request mass, all of these processes, would that be effective? And I came to the conclusion that it wouldn't be, based on my experiences of watching these processes before. And I'll tell you, I requested mass twice after the fact. So after a couple of my videos, one time after my court martial, I'll give an example. After my court martial, I wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy arguing why I should get an honorable discharge. It went through 2 general officers and got up to Headquarters Marine Corps, and my letter was not routed. I know this because the person up at Headquarters Marine Corps talked to my lawyer and like, we don't have it. So I requested mass to say, hey, explain to me why you didn't route my letter. And not only did the general not give me an audience, but he denied my ability to request mass because he said I was going through a separation. And it's like, this letter has to do with my separation. How do I even address it? You won't even talk to me about it. And so there's an example of, if they don't want to talk to you, there's always a way to use some type of legal jargon to just prevent you. Another example would be, I tried to prefer charges against General McKenzie. That is my legal right to do so according to the manual for court martial. And they just denied it. They wouldn't even take it. That's illegal in my opinion. And so, yeah, a lot of these processes exist, but when you're going against what they want, it can be very hard. And so, even my investigation, the investigating officer, Colonel McCullough, the engineer schoolhouse, was General Alford's previous operations officer at Mickey East. I know this because I was a regimental operations officer and I worked with them. And so when you're trying to have an impartial investigation and the general picks his previous officer that knows exactly what he wants, you're from the get-go gonna have a skewed investigation. And
that investigation went so far off the rails in terms of if they were trying to seek truth, they didn't even come close. And so, everyone wants to talk about these processes, but they don't address how they're broken. That's why Congress right now is taking sexual assault out of the military's hands, because our system, our military justice system, is skewed. Right now, the MARSOC 3, the senior defense attorney tells these young captains, like, this is substantiated, that defending the defendants would be bad for their career. Like, that's undue command influence. And so, like, the whole system is supposed to be separate from civilian legal authority because it remains impartial, and we've just lost our way on that.
Can you define for our viewership here what request mast is?
Request mast in the Marine Corps says you can levy a complaint up to the person that has the ability to address that complaint. So I tried to request mast to the commandant twice, 2 different events. However, the order reads the first general officer can adjudicate it. So it can, but in my opinion, my issues needed to be addressed by the commandant. But what happened, just so that the generals can protect each other, is General Alford found legal reasons to prevent it from going to the commandant, even though General Alford couldn't address my complaints. And so that's what it is. It's an ability for any service member to talk to the first general officer in their chain of command.
Well, thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. And that's all I have. Those are all my questions. You burned through them. I appreciate it. Anything else you'd like to add before we cut this or sign off?
So in closing, I'll just add, a lot of people have told me that what I did won't make change and that this is just the way it is and that I should just accept this. And I fundamentally, philosophically disagree. I think the time right now is for people to find a voice and make change. I think we can't all be wrong. We all see the problems pretty clearly. And our senior leaders have demonstrated through action that they're not willing to address them. And so I think I can make change. I think people that think like me are getting louder, and I'm excited to see what the future holds.
All right, Stu. Thank you so much for your time.